Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Kennedy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the third and final webinar in our summer series on housing vulnerability. Today's event follows two very interesting seminars held earlier this summer. The first was entitled Key Issues in Tackling Homelessness, and the second, Unhoused Trauma in Homelessness and Addiction, both of which can be found on our YouTube channel. Before we begin today, I would just like to outline some housekeeping issues. The webinar today will be recorded and uploaded on our YouTube channel. We'll be hosting a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box that you can find along the bottom of your screen to submit a question. If you have any technical issues, you can post them into the chat box and my colleague Tara Doyle will be on hand to assist you. As you know, the title of today's webinar is Women and Housing Vulnerability. Research on this topic has pointed out that women experience housing insecurity, and homelessness differently to men. The absence of women's experiences in housing discourse has meant that the issues they face can remain hidden and often are not reflected in housing policy. For example, despite the fact that it has been repeatedly demonstrated that domestic abuse plays a significant role in women's experiences of the home, housing, and housing insecurity, it is rarely understood or treated as a housing issue. In Ireland and internationally, housing and domestic violence policy and practice are typically managed by separate agencies with limited formalised coordination in place. This gender-blind approach to housing and homelessness can have negative implications for women and their families who are experiencing housing vulnerability. On that note, I'm delighted to be joined by two experts today to discuss this important and timely topic. First, we have Dr. Paula Mayock. Paula is an associate professor at the School of Social Work and Social Policy at Trinity College Dublin. Her research focuses primarily on marginalised youth and adult populations, covering areas such as homelessness, drug use, and drug treatment. She is the founder and co-director of the Women's Homelessness in Europe Network, which seeks to develop, promote, and disseminate multidisciplinary academic and policy relevant research that enhances understanding of women's homelessness. She is also co-editor of the Women's Homelessness in Europe book published in 2016. Her presentation today will provide you with an overview of the gendered nature of housing and its implications, and will discuss policy responses to women's housing vulnerability. We are also joined by Deidre Cartwright. She is a development manager for Standing Together, working within the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance in the UK. Her role focuses on improving the housing sector's response to domestic abuse through a whole housing approach, with a particular focus on the experiences of victim survivors living in the private rented sector. She also chairs the Perpetrators and Housing Working Group. Deidre brings 10 years of experience in the domestic abuse sector, both as a frontline practitioner and an advisor to national and local policymakers and practitioners in developing coordinated community responses to domestic abuse. Her presentation will discuss in particular how domestic abuse informs women's experiences of housing and homelessness, and it will introduce us to a framework for providing for the safety and housing needs of victims of domestic violence that has been implemented in the UK. So I'm very delighted to welcome these two speakers. And on that note, I'd like to invite Paula to turn on her camera and unmute, and she can share her screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to share my screen now.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Sarah. I'm delighted to participate in this webinar along with Deidre today on women and housing vulnerability. And I want to thank the Housing Agency for inviting me to speak on this important topic. So in today's presentation, what I hope to do is to provide a contextual backdrop by outlining relevant research on women, housing, homelessness, and domestic violence. And Deidre will be picking up and elaborating on some of the points that I'm going to raise, particularly in relation to the intersection of domestic violence and housing vulnerability. So I'll get started. So we're all aware of a housing affordability crisis in Ireland, and this is a global crisis that is well documented in countries across Europe, as well as in North America and Australia. And those most badly affected, as we know, by this housing crisis are those who are economically disadvantaged. Low income and poor households are more vulnerable to housing precarity and homelessness, but importantly, poverty and social exclusion are not gender neutral. Women are more likely to be at risk of poverty and social exclusion than are men. For example, analyses of successive Irish austerity budgets demonstrate that disadvantaged women, and particularly lone parents, have been disproportionately negatively affected. And this in turn has generated new levels of inequality and marginalization for women in relation to housing, housing precariousness, household debt, and poverty. Also, importantly and worth mentioning is that according to EU SILC data, for single parent households, the risk rather of poverty and exclusion is 65.9% across Europe. And in this regard, Ireland is ranked number 1 among EU 28 countries. Now, women's structural discrimination within housing markets is in fact well documented, so that in a general sense, women occupy a difficult or precarious position in relation to housing compared to their male counterparts. Now, this structural discrimination is related to broader structural inequalities. I suppose top among them would be the gender pay gap, women's greater likelihood to be employed in low-income occupations, and of course the issue of childcare, women's caring responsibilities, and the lack of access to affordable childcare. And housing has, in fact, long been recognised as one of the vehicles through which gender relations are mediated and sustained. And yet, as Sarah mentioned, women's particular relationship with housing and with housing markets tend not to be the subject of policy debate and tend not to be addressed specifically within housing policy. Very importantly, female-headed households specifically experience significant disadvantage in terms of their access to housing and their ability to sustain housing. Now, while women, and particularly low-income women, collectively experience disadvantage of access in terms of accessing housing and sustaining housing, women, very importantly, are not a homogenous group. Women's disadvantage intersects with other factors, and these include race, age, sexual orientation, class, gender identity, ethnicity, and immigration status. The situations of migrant women possibly provide a good example of this intersectionality because their particular circumstances may render them especially at risk of housing instability and homelessness. Now, migrant women's homelessness can be associated with intimate partner violence. This has been documented both in Ireland and internationally. But importantly, those whose immigration status depends on their spouse are particularly vulnerable. This is because they will lose their legal status upon leaving these relationships and consequently face exclusion from both housing markets and from labour markets. So this is, as I say, a good example of migration intersecting with other factors, including race, ethnicity, and immigration status. So this really highlights a need not to see women in general and low-income women as homogenous. Rather, they are a heterogeneous group who will have different situations and consequently a whole host of different needs. So moving on then to women and homelessness. Well, we have seen a rapid feminization of homelessness. This feminization of homelessness has been documented in Ireland, but in countries, many countries throughout Europe. Available estimates, there are a lot of difficulties with enumeration, but whatever estimates we do have suggest that women throughout European countries constitute between 22 and 38% of the total homeless population. And for some time, Ireland has recorded one of the highest proportions of women in its homeless population. At its peak in 2017, that figure was 47%, and currently women constitute between around 34 or 35%, again high in terms of European standards. Now, as we know, family homelessness has increased dramatically, and this dramatic increase does account for a great deal of the increase in the proportion of women of the total population who are homeless. And of course, these families, they're primarily low-income families, families headed, very often headed by a single parent. A large proportion are headed by a single parent. So these mothers are young and they're often parenting alone. Now, at the same time, we have this invisibility, traditionally or historically, of women's homelessness, both within research and within policy and, I suppose, public discourse as well. And some of this invisibility, it is related to a number of overlapping factors. One is the issue of measurement and the fact that enumeration techniques very frequently obscure the extent of women's homelessness. There is broad consensus that there is an undercounting of women's homelessness. And one clear example here is that women who access domestic violence services are not counted as homeless in many European countries, including the UK and Ireland. And of course, we know that according to ethos typology, in terms of the best way to measure or to enumerate, we ought to include women accessing domestic violence services in these counts and to enumerate them as homeless. There are also issues around women's responses to homelessness and the fact that they will often try to conceal their situations for as long as possible, so that they're living in hidden homeless situations. And again, these women are not counted. Now, as I said, research has, over the past several decades, neglected women's particular situations. But in fact, positively, a growing body of research is contributing to a gendered understanding of homelessness. For example, experiences such as childhood sexual abuse and violence, intimate partner violence, and maternal trauma have been demonstrated to push women along a trajectory of housing stability and homelessness. Now, these experiences are not limited to women. We know from research that men can experience childhood sexual abuse and violence, for example, and experience trauma both in their young lives and as young adults. But these experiences are in fact highly gendered. And the role of domestic and other forms of gender-based violence in women becoming homeless is possibly one of the strongest indicators that gender matters. We're all aware of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has really highlighted and brought into strong or stark focus the problem of domestic violence. During various lockdowns and stay-at-home periods, there's been strong evidence of rising number of girls and women experiencing domestic violence globally. The UN have coined this issue as the shadow pandemic. Now, research and policy have been critiqued for its gender neutral approach for some time, going back to the 1980s, in this breakthrough study by Watson and Osterbury, again by Edgar and Doherty in 2001. And really, there has been only sporadic attention, if you like, over several decades to women's homelessness, though this situation is improving and seen a dramatic improvement, particularly in the past 10 years. Yet housing and homelessness policy discourses throughout Europe largely ignore gender. There is also evidence that service responses lack gender sensitivity. This, of course, relates to the fact that homelessness service provision has been traditionally male-orientated. For understandable reasons in a way, because men have dominated the homelessness population. But with rising numbers and changing demographics and so on, there is a significant problem here, because there's the danger that women's specific needs are sidelined or ignored. And as Quilgars and colleagues have rightly and recently pointed out, gender neutral services can mean gender blind services. Now, I want to move on to say a few things about homelessness and domestic violence specifically. I should say, as a preamble perhaps, that particularly in Ireland and indeed in countries throughout Europe in relation to family homelessness, there is broad consensus that the drivers of family homelessness are primarily structural factors. In other words, they're factors associated with housing market conditions and with conditions within the private rental sector in particular. However, there is strong and consistent evidence of a mutually reinforcing relationship between women's homelessness and domestic abuse. We also know, and it is well documented, that women who experience domestic violence confront strong barriers to housing stability after they exit an abusive relationship. These barriers are strongly connected to a lack of affordable housing, to their experiences of housing market discrimination, and to the exclusion of large numbers of women, particularly low-income or marginalised women, from the labour market. So that for women, certainly a huge majority of women who experience domestic violence, there isn't a clear path to housing. And this essentially means that leaving an abusive relationship becomes a path to homelessness. Also, as Tutty and colleagues point out, inadequate housing and financial support may leave women with basically the choice between homelessness or effectively returning to the abusive partner. Very importantly, as pointed out by the United Nations in 2012, the lack of protection of women's rights to adequate housing can make them more susceptible to domestic abuse. I think this is a very important statement because it captures the fact that women very frequently remain in abusive homes because they don't have alternative housing, affordable housing to access. And also they may, as I made the point there, drawing on Tutty et al.'s work, that they can also be forced or feel that the only option is to return to an abusive home because of their lack of access to affordable housing. Now, I want to talk very briefly about, and this is very much whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid, given the time that we have here today. I want to talk briefly about service and policy responses to women's homelessness and to domestic violence. Well, we do know from a recent analysis of national strategic approaches to homelessness in 35 countries that despite some progress in terms of implementing housing-led approaches, across a good number of countries, particularly in Northern Europe, the staircase model of service provision prevails in an overwhelming majority of countries, and that includes Ireland. This essentially means that we're still very much operating on a treatment first model. In other words, we try to make people ready for housing ready, and then if and when housing is available, move them into housing. In terms of women-only services, well, women can access women-only services in a number of countries, but these accommodation types tend to be very limited. And very often then women have to access mixed gender settings, which has obvious implications and is problematic for women who have experienced victimization, whether that be sexual or physical or emotional. And in fact, very recently, Fianza has highlighted the need for women-only services, which they say are run by female staff for women, that they address who have been impacted at an emotional or physical level, and women-only spaces provide and allow women to speak freely about their experiences. And understandably, women will feel safer in these women-only services, and they offer opportunities for women to discuss what they have experienced. In terms of domestic violence then and service and policy responses, well, there is a heavy reliance on domestic refuge service provision, which has, of course, been historically underfunded throughout Europe. According to WAVE, throughout Europe, there is a 62% gap in service bed spaces available to women experiencing domestic abuse. And WAVE has also documented the situation for Ireland, which they say we are missing about 70% of recommended beds. Also, stays in domestic refuges are time limited in all countries, and so they should be, in fact, because of the potential institutionalizing effect of women and children remaining living in, if you like, unnatural home situation, in living in communal settings and so on. A significant problem, however, is that when the time is up, women's exit points and their move-on options are extremely constrained. And the research I've referenced here is a specific study of family homelessness and domestic violence funded by the Housing Agency and Focus Ireland, which is due to be published in October of this year. There is evidence also of women having to navigate a range of complex service systems as they attempt to secure both their own and their children's safety, and as they attempt to secure housing. So then the intersection of domestic violence and women's homelessness and typical or responses to this. Well, domestic violence and homelessness have tended to be classified and understood as discrete processes. And Sarah alluded to this also in her introduction. For this reason, then, they are responded to by separate service systems. And this is, of course, despite the fact that, as I have discussed, they are intertwined and overlapping by their very nature. Now, this disconnect between homelessness and domestic violence services is well documented. It is not unique to Ireland. It has been documented in the United States, in Australia, and in countries throughout Europe. Countries are moving forward with addressing this. The Australians have done a lot of work on it. And of course, you're going to hear in a few moments about the whole housing approach from Deidre. The need for better coordination and integration of response and service responses, interagency work, and so on, has been highlighted repeatedly and again very recently here by police and colleagues. There should be further cooperation and exchange between homeless and domestic violence sectors with a view to responding to the needs of women escaping violence and to improving the housing outcomes of the support provided within the DV sector. So this issue is I suppose, a hot topic within policy arenas at the moment. So just some concluding comments. Well, positively, discourses are shifting, albeit gradually, and the nature of the debate on homelessness and domestic violence is changing. And the very fact that we're here today very positively demonstrates that. However, there is a lack of integration among stakeholders, within policies, among service providers, and this remains a significant problem within most countries. So as Turner and Cressy point out, while not the sole factor, the network of services, how the network of services relate to another or indeed don't, indeed impacts their cumulative effect on these issues. And particularly problematic then are these siloed responses where there isn't an interconnectedness between various professionals, service providers, and of course we need structures to facilitate this. The case for policy and service initiatives that aim to directly address the intersection of DV and housing vulnerability is indeed compelling. I think that Deirdre's presentation will demonstrate that. And there is evidence now that greater and more effective collaboration between homeless, housing, and DV service sectors has great potential to enhance efforts to meet the housing and safety needs of domestic violence survivors. So thank you for listening, and I'll stop sharing the slides and hand over to Deidre at this point.
That's great. Thank you very much, Paula, for that very interesting and compelling presentation. I think it will it'll be a very good introduction and overview for Deirdre's presentation, which I would invite her to share her screen now. And I would just remind people, if you have a question, you can pop them in the Q&A box. Thank you.
That working? Can everyone see it?
Yeah, we can see your notes there, so I think you might just need to change the display options.
Right, okay.
That's it.
Oh, you got it already?
Oh no, sorry.
Hold on just a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Can you see that?
Not yet.
Oh, I know it happened.
I can also share it for you if it's easier.
I think I've got it. I actually forgot to share my screen, which is probably
yeah, that's it. Perfect.
the basic thing. And now I've gone into presenter mode. So can you see my notes or not?
No.
No.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. That's always your worst nightmare. So thanks very much to the Housing Agency for inviting me to be here, and thanks very much to Paula for her very informative presentation, which is a great entryway into my presentation as well, which, as has already been mentioned, really focuses on a whole housing approach to supporting survivors of domestic abuse, which is a model that we've developed in the UK, which I'd like to share with you. Just to give you a bit of background to begin with. So I work for Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse, and we are a national domestic abuse organization working across the UK. Our roots around 20 years ago are working within West London to build local partnerships and collaborative working across agencies and professionals in response to domestic abuse. And that local coordinated response has really been the basis for our approach in working more nationally to support services and professionals to develop what we've defined and has been defined within the US as the coordinated community response to domestic abuse. And by the coordinated community response to domestic abuse, we mean bringing all communities and agencies together to have a role to play in response to domestic abuse. That the, I guess, responsibility should not be placed on victims of domestic abuse to be identified and to access support. And that narrative actually needs to be shifted, and that it's the role of every professional who has some contact and interactions with survivors to be able to identify them and play a role in response in a coordinated and a collaborative way. And in particular, that includes housing's role within response to domestic abuse. But what I want you to be able to take away from today's presentation is a few things. One is that, as Paula had already said, experiences of domestic abuse and housing and homelessness are extremely intertwined for women, and we can't talk about one without understanding the other. And it's a very gendered experience. And I also want to just state from the beginning that we as an organization acknowledge and recognize that men experience domestic abuse as well, and that women can be perpetrators as well. But we also know that domestic abuse is very much a gendered experience. We know that women are far more likely to experience domestic abuse than men, and we know that men are far more likely to be perpetrators of domestic abuse. We also know that women are more likely to be killed as a result of domestic abuse. We know that they're more likely to experience ongoing forms of coercive and controlling behavior. And we also know that they are more likely to become homeless and experience long-term economic and housing insecurity as a result of domestic abuse. And we know that that is for that very reason, that interplay between housing, homelessness, and domestic abuse, that we need a housing response to survivors of domestic abuse that isn't actually based on, I guess, the assumption that survivors of domestic abuse need to get to a point of crisis where they need to leave their abusive relationship and make that choice between becoming homeless or experiencing that ongoing abuse, potentially being killed. But actually, housing providers can play a role much earlier on in identifying domestic abuse much sooner and actually preventing homelessness rather than reacting to women who are becoming homelessness. And that's why in 2014, Standing Together came together with Gen2 and Peabody, which are two large UK-based housing associations, to create what we have called the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance. And the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, to begin with, very much focused on the role of social housing providers in response to domestic abuse, both in identifying individuals experiencing domestic abuse and holding perpetrators to account, but also the support that they can provide to survivors in order to achieve safety, but also to achieve housing security and to actually prevent homelessness. And what we did is create with partners a set of DAHA accreditation standards for social housing providers to attain in order to show that they have a robust collaborative approach to domestic abuse across the organization, so they meet the needs of all tenants who might be experiencing domestic abuse. But as many of you probably already know, the response to domestic abuse doesn't just sit with social housing providers, because survivors of domestic abuse live in all sorts of housing situations, whether or not they are accessing supported and sheltered accommodation, whether they are chronically homeless and rough sleeping, whether they privately own their own home or they privately rent their home. They require a response that meets their individual needs. And as Paula's already discussed within her presentation, we need to look at the intersectionality of women's experiences of domestic abuse in housing, particularly women who are extremely vulnerable and minoritized. So thinking about the experience of women with no recourse to public funds as an example, in accessing housing support to meet their individual needs. And that's why in 2018, DAHA and Standing Together partnered with domestic abuse and housing providers across the UK to look at what we've now defined as a whole housing approach to domestic abuse that considers the housing needs of survivors in any type of housing tenancy, but also brings together housing professionals and domestic abuse responses together so that we're providing a holistic response that isn't built on this idea that for a woman to become safe from domestic abuse, we need to wait to the point at which she's at crisis, when she needs to leave that abusive relationship and become homeless. Actually, what can we do to prevent her from becoming homeless? And in the instances where she does need to flee due to domestic abuse, what can we do to ensure she isn't enduring that long-term economic and housing insecurity so we can minimize the impact of domestic abuse? And crucially, what it looks at is, what are we doing in order to hold perpetrators to account for the behavior? For too long, we've put pressure on survivors to be able to make themselves safe, to be able to come forward to services, to make themselves homeless when it is actually the perpetrator who is the cause of harm. And they should be the ones to be removed from the family home and to be held for account. And what are we doing in order to support survivors within that situation? But I think that in order to first understand why we need a whole housing approach to domestic abuse, which I'll go into the details about later, we first really need to have an understanding of the interplay between domestic abuse, housing, and homelessness. And as I've already started saying throughout the beginning of my presentation, I think throughout the world, we have operated on a misconception of domestic abuse. One, that it's only physical, and two, that is physical violence when it becomes so unendurable for a woman that she then has to leave that situation and she has to become homeless. And that is the point at which housing intervenes. When she is homeless, they provide support. And as Paula has already alluded to, that support doesn't meet the needs of women who often then find themselves enduring long-term homelessness and economic insecurity. But actually, if we look at the nature of domestic abuse, we'll see that the impact of domestic abuse on housing starts from the very beginning of their experiences of domestic abuse. And it's used as a form of abusive tactics by perpetrators of domestic abuse. Within the UK, in the last year, we have passed the Domestic Abuse Act. And the Domestic Abuse Act has done many things to change the landscape of how we respond here to domestic abuse. But one of the things that it has done is given a statutory definition to domestic abuse. And that statutory definition of domestic abuse really encompasses all of the tactics and abusive behaviors that a perpetrator will use in order to basically have power and control within that relationship, whether they're a family member or whether or not they're an intimate partner. And I've included the UK domestic abuse definition here for you today, just to give you a real understanding of that all-encompassing nature of abusive behaviors and how it's that interplay between psychological, physical, sexual, economic, and emotional abuse. And center of many perpetrators' abusive behaviors is coercive and controlling behavior, which is the use of many different forms of abusive behaviors in order to create fear and fear, dependence, and isolation, so that survivor doesn't have the ability to remove themselves from that abusive situation, that they're dependent on the perpetrator, that they can't access resources, and that they're genuinely fearful that if they try and escape that abusive relationship, that they will be killed or severely harmed, or their children will be taken away from them, or in fact that they will become homeless as a result of that abuse. There are some really important changes through the UK definition of domestic abuse. One is that it used to include financial abuse, and now that's been replaced by economic, which financial abuse really didn't recognize anything beyond the manipulation or use of money, whereas economic abuse really encapsulates all of the ways in which a perpetrator will control a survivor's access to resources in order to be independent from the perpetrator, which can include coerced debt, which can include not allowing them to hold a job, and it also can include their housing. But this kind of use of coercive and controlling behavior and this use of economic abuse to keep a survivor trapped in that relationship is so important in understanding the interplay between domestic abuse and housing. So moving on to my next slide, I think it's important to state that from the beginning, a survivor of domestic abuse's housing and home is impacted from the moment at which they begin to experience domestic abuse from their perpetrator. And that's because domestic abuse thrives because it happens behind closed doors, where a perpetrator can act in an abusive way without being held to account, without being seen, and the onus and the responsibility is placed on the survivor to be able to go forward and identify that they're experiencing domestic abuse, to approach services and ask for support, and to actually hope that they will be believed when in fact they aren't always believed and they aren't always supported. And it continues to place the onus on survivors to make themselves safe instead of the perpetrator being held to account. And sadly, home is the place where perpetrators are also most likely to kill. So the femicide census in 2018 reported that there were 149 women killed by 147 men, and that 72% of these women were killed by intimate current or former partners or family members. And that in 68% of these instances, women were killed within their own home by the perpetrator. So were homeless supposed to be a place of safety and refuge and security? For victims of domestic abuse, home is a dangerous place, and one in which they need to escape from. And as already talked about on the previous slide, perpetrators use the home as a form of economic abuse and coercive control, whether they are causing rent arrears and damages to the property in order to make her tenancy insecure, in order to cause debt and economic security so that she can't leave him, whether or not he is getting himself on the mortgage and taking control of that mortgage so that she doesn't have sole ownership, whether or not he's coercing a shared deposit, depleting that deposit, or forcing her to hand over that deposit in order for him to leave the property. There are many ways in which a perpetrator will use shared housing as a form of abuse. And as I think Paula already talked about in more detail than I'm going to, is that domestic abuse is the leading cause of homelessness amongst women, that women are placed in a situation where when they want to leave that relationship, their only option is to end their tenancy, to leave their own home, and to have to start again. And you know, we need to shift that narrative away from the emphasis of survivors being the ones to leave because of the long-term economic and housing insecurity that places on them. But what we've learned through DAHA and through the work that we've done with social housing providers is that if housing providers actually have an in-depth understanding of the interplay between housing and domestic abuse before they reach the point of crisis and they need to leave, that actually housing providers can play a significant role in identifying survivors of domestic abuse and providing a response early on. So in many of the housing providers that we've already worked with, when all housing professionals, from housing officers to contractors to maintenance workers, are trained to identify signs and symptoms of domestic abuse within a housing context, you know, lock changes, damages, rent arrears, antisocial behavior, which often don't lead them to think about domestic abuse. When they look at it from a domestic abuse lens, they can see that actually this is domestic abuse. We can link them into specialist services. We can offer them support to remain within their own home, whether that's forgiveness of rent arrears and damages, whether that's helping them move to new accommodation but maintain their secure tenancy, whether that's linking them into specialist support services. They can actually provide support that doesn't mean they have to reach that point of crisis. And as Paul's already talked about in that coordinated working, they can actually share information within multi-agency arrangements so that we have a coordinated community response to domestic abuse, where we're looking at the whole survivor and all of their needs and bringing agencies together to respond to their needs, whether they're health or police or specialist services, whether they're housing as well. We all need to work together to provide a response to domestic abuse. And when we talk about equipping social housing providers to respond to domestic abuse, we're not just talking about incidental training and awareness raising. It's a whole systematic approach to improving the whole housing agency and local authorities' response to domestic abuse. And that's why DAHA accreditation includes 8 very important accreditation standards, from policy and procedures and case management, risk assessment, making sure they're inclusive and accessible, that they're holding perpetrators to account, that they're working in a multi-agency and coordinated community way, that they have embedded training for all professionals, and that the response to domestic abuse is known to other professionals and to survivors of domestic abuse. But as I've already said, this is one element of a response to domestic abuse that needs to consider survivors in different tenure types with different needs, including the most vulnerable, especially women from minoritized and Black communities, and women experiencing multiple disadvantage, and mental health and substance use needs as well, who often find themselves to be chronically homeless. And this is why we developed, with partners across the domestic abuse and housing sectors across the UK, what's known as a whole housing approach, which provides a combination of housing and domestic abuse service options for survivors in any type of tenure. So if you look at the green circles that are at the top, those include all of the different types of tenure that a survivor might find themselves in. privately owned, rented, refuge accommodation, shelter housing, and supported and sheltered accommodation. And the white circles at the bottom are really looking at different types of initiatives to support women within these housing circumstances to either safely remain within their own home or to be able to quickly and effectively access alternative accommodation. So just to name a few of them, because I don't have time to go through all of them, Paula had already talked about the issues around refuge provision and the limitations of refuge, especially for vulnerable victims of domestic abuse, such as those with no recourse to public funds, but also the issue of the time-limited aspect of refuge and that women have nowhere to move on to. And a part of the whole housing approach is for local authorities to provide move-on accommodation for women who are moving forward from refuge, who aren't quite ready yet to move into fully independent accommodation. Housing First, for instance, is also clearly links to Paula's presentation around the needs for individuals who are experiencing multiple and complex needs to actually have their housing secured first before they're actually able to address their other needs around substance misuse, mental health, trauma, and domestic violence and abuse. And then another one to mention is managed reciprocals. And that's work that we do with social housing providers so that if a woman is made homeless as a result of domestic abuse, she doesn't actually lose her secure housing status, and that's transferred to her new housing situation. And I'll give the links to our housing toolkit so you have more information about each of these different initiatives. And what we've done over the last 3 years through funding from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government is pilot each of these initiatives alongside 3 pilot areas across England. So we worked with 3 local authorities in London, Cambridgeshire and Stockton-on-Tees. And each of these local authorities implemented all of the elements of the whole housing approach across the 3 of them. So no one local authority implemented all 12, it was various across all of them. And then standing together and surviving economic abuse, employed a private rented sector and private housing or private ownership development managers to work at a more strategic level to look at what are the experiences and needs of survivors living in private housing, because it's not something that has been fully investigated before. Who are the stakeholders involved in providing a response to the needs of those survivors? And how do we coordinate that as a part of a whole housing approach to domestic abuse? And we have resources that I'll connect to at the end of this presentation about that. And what we found is that obviously a whole housing approach does meet the needs of survivors, that it does prevent homelessness, and that it does prevent the escalation of abuse. And I realize my presentation has gone on for quite a long time. So when you receive these slides, I really encourage you to go through each of these case study examples, which show a survivor's journey when she has access to whole housing approach versus what her journey may have been had she not. And it shows that the interplay between housing professionals and domestic abuse service provision around her housing that enables her to address her needs and stay safely within her own home. And in preventing homelessness, the money that was saved throughout that process. So this story is very much focused on a woman who was living in social housing, who was able to access support around debt and rent arrears and complex needs, and was able to stay within her own home. And the second story is about a woman who shared a privately owned accommodation with her husband, who was experiencing domestic abuse. And when she received financial and economic support and advice alongside specialist domestic abuse support, she was able to maintain secure and stable housing. So what's next for the whole housing approach? So we finished the 3-year pilot where we were looking at different aspects of the whole housing approach across different boroughs. And we just received funding from the National Lottery to work over a 3-year period with one local authority that will implement all 12 aspects of the whole housing approach in unison, including a coordinator who will be at the center of that whole housing approach in bringing services and responses together in a coordinated way. We've also been working at influencing the implementation of the Domestic Abuse Act and how it pertains to local authorities' provision of safe and secure housing to survivors of domestic abuse and support within safe and secure housing. And I can provide more details through the Q&A as well. We're continuing to develop accreditation standards across all housing sectors, supporting sheltered accommodation, social housing, and the private rented sector. And we are working with partners across the domestic abuse and perpetrator response to look at actually what does a housing response to perpetrators look like as a means of holding them to account from a housing perspective, but also in providing housing options for perpetrators as a means to enabling survivors to stay within their own homes. And I've provided a list of resources that you can access after the presentation that goes into a lot more details about all of the elements of the whole housing approach. It talks about the impact of our pilot and provides local authorities with a guide on how to implement it. And then the last is various papers that are linked to on our website and research that talks about the connection between domestic abuse, housing, and homelessness. And I will end there.
Great, Deidre, thank you so much. It's great to get an international perspective on how the intersection of housing and domestic violence can be managed. So thank you very much for that. We'll now move to the Q&A session. Just to remind you that there is a Q&A box down the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, please do pop them in there. I'll just start with a question for yourself, Paula. You mentioned the feminization of homelessness and that it's particularly prevalent in Ireland. I was wondering if you could speak to the reasons why that is, why we're finding the particularly high levels in Ireland, how that came about.
Sure, of course. Well, it's obviously very deeply connected with our housing crisis. And I did mention that we've seen particularly steep rises in family homelessness. So women are obviously affected by family homelessness. It's not that single women are not impacted. And in fact, we also know that a lot of single women, so-called single women who access homelessness services are actually mothers who are separated from their children. But certainly the crisis of family homelessness is directly linked to the feminization of homelessness in Ireland.
Great, thank you. I'm building on that, Deidre. In your work, how do you manage the kind of family element of women's homelessness into the kind of policies and practices that you put in place in the whole housing approach?
I mean, we always consider women, you know, within the context of their families, and oftentimes when women are made homeless as a result of domestic abuse, that they have children in many circumstances, and that they need accommodation and support that meets the needs of them and their children. Mm-hmm. And that's why, you know, the whole housing approach is very much focused on the ability of women to be able to stay safely within their own home, so they're not uprooting themselves and their children, and their support networks and their schools and everything that they need to be able to have some form of stability and security within their lives. We know that, you know, the provision of refuge doesn't meet the needs of all women with children. We know that, you know, where they have more than one or two children, it's very difficult to find refuge spaces that meet their needs. We also know that women with older children, you know, they cannot access refuge, particularly if they have an older boy, because he won't be allowed within a refuge setting because of the risk for other survivors of domestic abuse and the rules around that. When, you know, Paula had mentioned about women who often have their children removed from them, it's really important to consider that with women who are experiencing you know, chronic homelessness and multiple disadvantage, where they're experiencing overlapping layers of trauma and abuse. And a part of that trauma is their children being taken away from them. And a part of their coping mechanisms for that trauma is actually, you know, the use of substances and, you know, the impact on their mental health. So that in providing things like housing first, which is one of the elements of whole housing approach, we are addressing her housing first, as it says, so that she can actually, you know, respond to her mental health needs, her substance use needs, that she can kind of get out of that cycle of trauma in order to address all of this, and potentially, in some circumstances, have her children, you know, placed back in her care if she's got stable housing, and with that stable housing addressing those other needs that social care would say place children at risk. But yeah, it's an evolving thing to continue to work on and understand.
That's great, thank you. A question that's come in from one of the attendees: would women's groups with a mixed gender service provide women's only space for women to share their experiences? Or in the context of domestic violence, would this potentially place a woman experiencing domestic violence at greater risk? Is there a way this could be managed safely? I'll leave that. Is there either of you that would like to take that?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but I think it was about having women-only spaces within mixed accommodation settings.
Yeah.
And that is something that, so we have a Housing First team within Standing Together, and we've been doing a lot of work with St. Mungo's that looks particularly at women's experiences of sheltered and supported accommodation and the need for trauma-informed responses, but also women's only spaces. And that talks specifically about the need for women's only spaces within mixed accommodation. Because I guess the fact of the matter is women are going to be accessing mixed accommodation, and that a separate space for women is necessary for them within that context. There's also to be considered the fact that not all women who are experiencing domestic abuse and want to access support from housing providers are actually separated from the perpetrator. And we really operate on an assumption that when survivors are accessing support, they want to leave the perpetrator, they want to be separated from him. And if we premise all of our support based on that, we're not reaching a whole lot of women who need support while they're in that relationship. And what we found is in mixed gendered shelter and support accommodation, the men and the women are still in a relationship and they want to be in a relationship, yet the woman still needs that separate support around her experience of domestic abuse and around her wider experiences of trauma and multiple disadvantage. So don't know if I've answered the question, but yeah,
no, I think you have.
I don't know
Paula,
if Paula has anything to add.
Would you like to come in there? Because I know you spoke about women-only spaces in your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, it is challenging. I mean, in terms of the provision of spaces within mixed gender settings, I think there is a real need for it. Certainly coming out of the research that I mentioned, for example, a lot of women who ended up in family hubs with their children were exposed to violence in those settings. And from hearing violence and then having to use communal spaces with perpetrators of violence, having after they themselves leaving an abusive relationship. So certainly it's something that really needs to be addressed within a lot of the settings that where women inevitably or at the moment are certainly finding themselves in.
That's great. Thank you very much. I know we're coming up on 2 o'clock. If it's okay with the two speakers, I might just borrow 3 or 4 more minutes of your time to get through a couple more questions, if that's okay, because there's a few that's come in. So Paula, I'll go to you next. And we have a question here about the reporting of women as homelessness, and that's something that you mentioned in your presentation. As often the numbers aren't captured correctly, women's homelessness isn't really accounted for. Are there any practical steps that you think that we can take to improve on these kind of methods?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, of course, we used to enumerate women in domestic violence refuge as homeless. I think we need to reinstate that, and that they should be included in our administrative data system, which is our PASS system, because that would more accurately reflect nationwide the level of homelessness being experienced by women. Also, I think that we could improve at local level the collection of data there. Enumerating hidden homelessness is more complex, but certainly it is a very serious omission at the moment not to include. So that's, as an immediate step, I think we need to enumerate women in accessing domestic violence services.
And is that something, Paula, that's unique to the Irish context, the non-inclusion of women in refuges, or is it something that's seen more broadly internationally?
No, it's not unique to Ireland, but some countries do enumerate, and that's positive. We used to enumerate, so as far as I'm concerned, there's no reason why we can't revert to enumerating people accessing domestic violence refuge services.
Great, thank you. I have a question for Deidre in relation to perpetrator management. Can you give an example of perpetrator management, how it might work, how to keep women and children safe during this time, and how agencies can work together on this?
I mean, that's a big question because there's a lot of forms of perpetrator management and perpetrator responses. I think particularly in the UK, there's been kind of a real focus on perpetrators and perpetrator programs to help perpetrators recognize and address their behaviors where and when that is appropriate, and is the wishes of the survivor, and that the survivor is supported throughout that process, and the risk of escalation of abuse is monitored and responded to as the perpetrator goes through that management process, through the behavioral change programs, etc. But when we talk about behavioral perpetrator management, it's also wider than that, and it's about actually making the perpetrator be held to account for their behavior. It's looking at criminal and civil injunctions that remove the perpetrator from the family home, and it's also about making sure that he is charged, that he is found guilty, that he is, that the criminal justice system actually holds perpetrators to account. And that, again, they remove the onus on the victim to have to lead that process, but the criminal justice system takes that forward. But also within a housing setting, we know that housing providers can actually shift the responsibility away from the survivor to become homeless as a result of domestic abuse, and actually put the responsibility on perpetrators. So at the moment, there isn't a lot of housing legislation that enables social housing providers in particular to do that very effectively. So, social housing providers can remove a perpetrator from a social property after the survivor has already been made homeless, or they can actually remove a perpetrator from a property based on antisocial behavior legislation while the victim is still there. But that's it. It's really, you have to be very creative and understand the legislation very well to be able to do that. We've been working very closely with Women's Aid to basically develop a mechanism that survivors can use in civil court to be able to remove perpetrators from a joint tenancy within the social housing sector, so that they don't have to be made homeless as a result of domestic abuse. We tried to get that as an amendment to the Domestic Abuse Act. We weren't able to for lots of reasons, but now there's going to be a consultation with the MHCLG that actually looks very specifically at removing perpetrators from joint tenancies so that survivors can remain in their own home. And that's part of what we mean about perpetrator management, is that accountability. And then we're doing some work with Drive, who is a UK-based perpetrator management response, to actually look at housing provision for perpetrators while they go through behavioral management programs, because we know when survivors have that space away from perpetrators that they can be more safe, but actually it gives them the opportunity to reflect on, actually, do we want him to come back into the family home, and what needs to be done to move him on to alternative accommodation long term.
Great, thank you for that. We're very much coming up on the end of time. Just one final question to the two of you. One thing that's come out kind of from both of your presentations is the importance of a holistic approach and an integrative approach. And then if that's where we want to move in the Irish context, I would like to invite both of you just to provide your comments on that, if you had any guidance or advice on how to begin that process of a holistic and integrative approach. So Paula, I might come to you first, and then Deidre, I'll ask you to give the final comment. Thank you.
Well, it is challenging. I think it will demand a lot of planning. I think local authorities need to be central to this, and if we are to move effectively towards an integrated approach. I think that there's a lot of learning we can take from the whole housing approach that Deidre has outlined here. And I think this, in fact, I think that helps to focus the mind on the range of agencies that need to be involved. And I think very strongly coming out from Deidre's presentation as well is the whole emphasis on prevention and not relying on waiting for the crisis point, and to develop ways to keep women in their homes. I think the other piece that's very critical, that really stands out to me from Deidre's presentation, is the understanding of the nature of domestic abuse and the training that's provided, not just one-off training, not just a one-off input, but that this, as Deidre has explained, it needs to be not incidental, but very linked to a coordinated community response. So I think there is a lot of work to be done. I think we need to immediately move in that direction. And also, I think what is critical, and again, very clear from Deidre's input, is that the success of this approach is being monitored and evaluated.
Thank you.
And so we shouldn't implement a pilot or whatever it may be unless we're going to evaluate the outcome, and that ideally should be a process evaluation.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And Deidre, just finally, if you want to pass on any advice or anything you'd like to comment on there.
I think beyond my presentation, which very much focused on that integrated, holistic approach, I think what Paula said about it needing to come from local authorities is really important. Where we have implemented a whole housing approach and will pilot it going forward, it is very much at a local authority level who take ownership of that. As local authorities are the ones to implement our Domestic Abuse Act in the provision of support within safe accommodation, the responsibility sits with them. But also I think it's starting at a strategic level where domestic abuse strategies and housing and homelessness strategies need to come together, and those strategic partnerships need to be made at a strategic level and then coming down operationally, rather than the other way around, because we need that strategic buy-in and partnership building from the beginning. So I think it's about that partnership and linking up between domestic abuse and housing at a local authority level.
That's great. Well, we are 10 minutes over time, so I'd like to thank both the speakers for their time today and their additional time. And I'd like to thank everybody who attended for all your questions and for your engagement. I'll leave it there. Thank you all very much. And thank you very much to our speakers for your contributions today.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.